Please pray with me. More of you, O Christ, less of me. More of you, O Christ, less of me. More of you, O Christ, less of me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts draw us closer to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. This week and last week we read stories from the Gospel of John, even though year A is usually the Gospel of Matthew, and we were reading sort of the greatest hits of Matthew for a while there. And it's important to know that the narrative world of Matthew is really different than the narrative world of John. And when I say a narrative world, it's kind of like, you go in a book and you've entered a world, right? And sometimes it's a world and sometimes it's a world that's completely made up, like with science fiction. It's a world that has never been, maybe never will be. But in the same way also that we can all tell stories in a different way. And it's always important when thinking about the Bible to remember how many thousands of years that these texts were written down and assembled. Things were different from when Matthew wrote and then when John wrote, near as we can tell. And they were in different places, and things in the world had changed. For example, when somebody writes something now, 9/11 is a given. The Second World War is a given. Right now, as bombs are falling in Iran, I don't know about you, some of you aren't old enough, but most of you are old enough. I keep remembering the late 70s and the Iran hostage crisis. Are you revisiting those memories? Right? Because I'm like, what do I really know about Iran? Well, most of it is I remember in high school burning an effigy of the Ayatollah Khomeini in Midland, Texas. Not kidding, while drinking peach daiquiris, but that's a different story. Oh, and by the way, Dan, that was the Junior Engineering Technological Society that had the peach daiquiri parties and burned the Ayatollah Khomeini at the same party. It was your crowd, which I was part of in high school. So different narrative worlds, different things have happened. Different things have happened. The Jewish people have now really been spread to the ends of the earth. Very few are still in Palestine by the time John is writing. And most importantly, when John is writing, and it's important for this text and especially, a movement within the Jesus movement has started that is later called Gnosticism. Anybody ever heard of the Gnostic Gospels? There you go. You're so good. You're so well trained. So Gnosticism was this idea that you could really know. Gnosis in Greek means to know. And they eventually were declared a heresy, in part because nobody likes a know-it-all. And they had created sort of this separation between the believers, of the people who really know and the people who don't know. And it was very disruptive having that kind of movement within the movement. And it was so disruptive that it was eventually, as I said, called a heresy. And the writings they had, we now know as the Gnostic Gospels, disappeared for many centuries, and we didn't find them for a long time. We mostly would hear the arguments of the winners about these horrible Gnostics who claimed they knew everything. And there was a good piece of that Gnosticism that was about pretending like you are God and God is not God. And so I agree with that. I agree that that's problematic. When you decide you know more than God, or you know God's mind, hello? Any modern Gnostics? Have we heard people who tell you what God thinks? We've certainly had people who will tell you, I know God's mind, and you have to go. It's been used to divide people now, too. There is such a thing as sort of modern Gnosticism. On the other hand, they were also the mystics. They were people who were tuned in to that beyond what the normal way of thinking about things was. And that can be super helpful. Not if you turn it immediately into doctrine and dogma, but if you do allow yourself to imagine the unimaginable. Just like a good book. You go into there and you can imagine a world, the world you want to live in. When I was a kid, that was Star Trek. I wanted to live in that world that didn't have money. Yes, live long and prosper. That didn't have money, that was diverse, that was principled, that was, people didn't really get ill, they were cared for. I wanted to live in that world. I kind of still want to live on the Starship Enterprise. Now, subsequent versions of Star Trek got grittier and more difficult because the original version was so idealistic. People were like, well, really? Are we really going to evolve that much? And so by the time you get to Voyager, it's kind of insane. I wanted to live in that world. So let's go back to this story in John. So John, I think it's good to know, almost didn't make the Bible. There were people in the 3rd century when the canon, the Bible, was being put together. They decided which books were in and which books were not, because there were a lot of other gospels, there were a lot of other writings, and some of them we still read from, like the Apocrypha. We will occasionally read from them. They're the ones that kind of wound up on the cutting room floor. The Gospel of John almost didn't make it because they thought it was too Gnostic. It was too mystical. It was too not just telling the stories of Jesus. And I say all this because it's really impossible to hear these healing stories as just healing stories, because John's always got more going on. You know, there's, I'm the light of the world. This is not just, oh, poof, you're no longer blind. No, this is got all this mystical overlay. And what can we learn from that? Well, on one level, John addresses a common belief in the ancient world that infirmity, that illness was a sign of sin. Now, I can't even imagine how brutal that must have been because, you know, they didn't have particularly good medicine and people were probably sick a lot. But if you were born blind, they assumed that either you had sinned, as a baby, I guess, or your parents had sinned, and this was God's vengeance upon you. So most sermons you'll hear on this focus mostly on that. And it's important because we kind of still do it. We kind of still do it. We might not say it as blatantly, but I can tell you as a fat girl walking through the world that I often get the, you know, if you just ate right, exercised more, or whatever their particular prescription is, then you wouldn't be fat. Now, they didn't see my fat mother. They didn't see other fat people in my family. They didn't know my genetic history. They don't know anything about it. But you'll get that judgment. And as Brian said, when he said, you know, I was born this way, God doesn't make any mistakes. I was like, well, you just preached the sermon, honey. Some of us are born queer, too. Some of us are born odd. Some of us are born, well, all of us are born something. And there's usually somebody who's not very impressed. Because as we know, normal's not a thing. Normal's in the eye of the beholder. And it's usually close to who you are. So we still do this. And it's important to take Jesus' advice and not even ask that question. Who sinned? Nobody sinned. He's blind. That's how it is. But of course, what John is really doing is it's a metaphor, because John, a little bit gnostic, certainly mystical, is talking about light and dark. He's talking about being able to see even if you're blind. He's talking about coming to an understanding of things beyond just what you can see with your eyes. To see the light of the world, regardless of your situation. To be the light of the world, regardless of whether your eyes work, your spleen works, any other human condition that makes you feel or be perceived as less than, whatever it is. So we're going to end this service today with, of course, probably the most famous hymn ever, Amazing Grace. How many of you know the story of this hymn? I know a few of you do. The story of this hymn, I think, is why it has so much power. John Newton, not related to Isaac Newton or Olivia Newton-John. John Newton, in his early life, was the captain of a slave ship. He captained ships that held people in bondage and crossed the ocean many times with human cargo. And he came back to London and was struck blind. Who knows why he went blind? Could have been, he had macular degeneration. Who knows? We don't know. But he was blind. And in his blindness, he recognized the horror of what he had done. And, I don't care what you've ever done. Most of us have not sinned on the level of taking people into captivity, locked them in a ship, and crossed the ocean many times. That is pretty bad. That is, I think we would all agree, pretty horrible. And made a lot of money doing it. So when he became blind, he gave away all his money, and he became a preacher. And he wrote this hymn. And so a lot of people, some of our Unitarian friends in particular, will take out that saved a wretch like me, and they'll turn it into saved a soul like me. He was a wretch. And some of us have a little inner wretchedness. We may not be as wretched. And I personally, soul is fine. I'm not really judging them for that. But you miss something about where this hymn really comes from if you take the wretch out. And so his blindness actually became his method of seeing. I once was blind, but now I see. And the truth is, now I'm blind, so I can see. So Jesus is saying it doesn't matter whether your eyes work or not. Can you see other humans as valuable? Can you see other people as beloved? Can you see your neighbor as valuable as yourself? And he preached that for the rest of his life. He preached that humans were beloved of God. And we now sing this song in secular places, in many other places. And of course, it's why it's beloved in the African American community, because they know that story for sure. I'll tell you what, they know all about John Newton. How can we become people who see through the dark places? Like in Evan Hansen, when the darkness comes, can you reach out your hand and will someone be there? Will you be found? Will you be found? And will you be the person who, when someone reaches out, they find your hand? Because that's really what we're looking for in life. We're just trying to walk each other home. We're just trying to find companions for the journey. Folks who understand if we have had a great loss. People who understand if we're ill. People who, when we're lonely, will catch us when we fall. Folks who will be a conduit of grace to us, a conduit of love and kindness. And we will return those gifts in kind. We will find ways to catch each other. And that's why we need church. That's the point, is you can't learn how to do that in isolation. You can't go in a room by yourself and figure that out. You have to be with other people. Catch them when they're about to fall. Allow yourself to be caught when you are at your worst. And trust that all of our gifts and all of our abilities to love are needed, wanted. Make the world a better place. And that is who all of you are. I look around this room and I just see so much grace, so much blessing, so much kindness, so much willingness to help, so much willingness to catch others when they fall. Most of us could work a little more on being caught when we're about to fall. But that's why we're here. And may we see even when we can't see. And may it be so. Amen.